kind of already started to quiet down, so I guess I need to start the program. You've led me, which is great. My name is Matthew Schwartz. I'm the Associate Vice President of Research at University of West Florida. It's my honor to serve as the moderator for tonight's discussion. This whole group came about because of an activity at the Power Up Energy Expo last fall, where I got introduced to Jessica from the American Security Project. We've been very glad to, we're talking about might UWF be interested in hosting an event on this National Climate Security Tour. And as I was just sharing with Captain Kinsella, I thought it was a great idea, and then the more I thought about it, the more I realized we actually have some wonderful experts from our own university that we can bring into this group, and then supplement it with some excellent experts that they brought from outside. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel. I'm just going to give a very broad introduction and then invite each of them to take a couple minutes and share how their own position, current or former, informs their thoughts on this concept of climate resiliency in military installations. For the panelists, because I haven't been able to speak with each of you, we have in each pair of seats, we have a microphone that's going to be shared across. Too many of these mics creates too many problems when it comes to feedback and such. So I'm going to do it in no particular order other than the ones where I know people have already gotten some seats. I'm going to start off with Dr. Alibašić from our Department of Administration and Law, also coordinator for our Public Administration Master's program. Captain Rick Miller, who comes to us, he has several different titles here listed there, the Pharos Mission Critical Solutions. Rick is also our fellow from the American Security Project, and will be sharing his experience there. Captain Kinsella is currently the director of the Aylstock, Witkin, Kreis, and Overholtz Center for Leadership here at the UWF College of Business. And many in the audience will know him as the recent former commanding officer of Naval Air Station Pensacola. Dr. Brian Crisher, there he is, from the Reuben O.D. Askew Department of Government at the University of West Florida. This is Laurie Murphy from the Stormwater Training Center, also I think twice graduated alumna of the University of West Florida. We're very glad to have her with her stormwater expertise. And last and certainly not least, Mr. Eric Christianson from the Emerald Coast Regional Council. This is a very, and I get to sit. This is a great and very informed panel on a lot of different issues. That what we're talking about tonight and where this whole idea came out of, as I mentioned, was the Power Up Energy Expo, and we were talking about some areas related to clean power technology, and it fed very quickly into a discussion about climate security in Northwest Florida, and specifically best practices and lessons learned from military installations. Oh, and I should say, and he's not up here, but Tucker Hamilton back there on the microphone, or on the camera, is with the American Security Project, and the American Security Project is our sponsor on this, and they've really been amazing in getting gathering the panel and getting the information together. Thank you. So what I was hoping to do is start and give each of you, and for some it'll be easier than others, but try to give you 1 or 2 minutes to talk about kind of how your current or former position aligns with this idea of climate security in Northwest Florida, specifically tied in with this military installation resilience. And Eric, I might start with you and then work our way across.
Sure, you hear me there? Yeah, so my name is Eric Christianson. I'm a planner with the Emerald Coast Regional Council. I'll go a little bit more into who we are and what we do. But the big thing that I'm here to promote is we are kicking off our Military Installation Resilience Review, which is a really local, kind of from here to Bay County to Tyndall Air Force Base, looking at all of the potential resiliency threats to our military missions, specifically looking at the land that's outside the bases themselves. So all of the civilian-controlled local government, utilities that the missions rely on, and making sure that they are up to snuff and are able to survive whatever is thrown at them, human or man-made. So that's what we're working on, and that's what I'm here to promote today.
Hello everybody, great to see you all here. Thanks for being here. Tim Kinsella, and I was, as you mentioned, the skipper of NAS Pensacola. I think there's 2 times in my career when this topic, I really got to sort of work in and understand a little bit better. The first was when I was with NATO. I was a defense planner with NATO, and part of my job was to go to all the foreign countries as a maritime defense planner, and I would negotiate with them on what they were going to make available to NATO. It was pretty interesting. And the idea of the High North, how the High North was going to become a modern battleground for World War III as the ice caps recede due to climate change and as more minerals become exposed because the ice caps receding, and the fight over those natural resources in the High North was going to be an issue. And then in the south, that's for the northern flank and the southern flank with migration. If you talk to Norwegians, they'll tell you that it's going to be the High North. If you talk to an Italian, they will tell you that their biggest challenge is migration coming from the Saharan region of Africa. And then coming here to NAS Pensacola, it was more experiential rather than policy driven, because of course we went through Hurricane Sally on the base of $550 million worth of damages done just to the base alone. And that's what happens when you have a base. That base has been there since 1826 as a US naval installation when Commodore Warrington went there to fight off the pirates in the Caribbean. So it's been there since 1826. No, that's why he did it. He came here to fight pirates in the Caribbean, believe it or not. Seemed like a great place to put a base, but Pensacola is number 8 in the nation for places most likely to get a hurricane. And we've gotten our fair share of hurricanes here. And every time a hurricane comes through NAS Pensacola, it devastates it, completely devastates it, whether it's from the rain on old buildings or whether it's from wave action on our waterfront. We have a 100-year-old seawall there that's falling apart. We're one hurricane away from that base getting wiped out. So it was, I got to understand how important climate resiliency is to our military stations because I lived through it. So I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you everyone for being here this evening. I appreciate Dr. Schwartz's introductions and his commitment to this topic. I believe it's very important and very timely. My name is Alibašić. I'm in the public administration, our graduate degree program at the University of West Florida. And my primary research is climate resilience, sustainability, and governance. So I look at this as an important topic because obviously we live in Northwest Florida, and one of the area that's most impacted by the changes in climate, manifested through extreme flooding, through different issues, and including increased frequency and intensity of hurricanes. And these things are extremely important to our military, and military facilities that bring significant economic impact to the region are going to be impacted as a result. And my primary focus through all of this work is to look at collaborative governance where local governments such as City of Pensacola or other regional government agencies and organizations and businesses as well can work collaboratively with the military to address these threats. Recently, City of Pensacola adopted the climate adaptation mitigation recommendations, and as a result of the task force work, some of you are here in the audience, we've seen significant involvement in looking at climate change in this area, including creating the sustainability director position and greenhouse gas emission report, vulnerability studies, and so forth. So I look forward to the discussion this evening, and I'm very happy to see this many people this evening. Thank you.
Hey, good evening. Rick Miller. Thank you all for coming and taking some time to express your interest, and hopefully we'll have some good questions and dialogue later. As Matt alluded to, I wear a number of different hats, so very quickly, I'm the executive director of the South Florida Defense Alliance, which is focused down in the southeast corner of the state of Florida, similar to the West Florida Defense Alliance here, looking after the installations in the Panhandle. We do the same down in southeast Florida. And as part of that team, we helped pull together and get the first Military Installation Resilience Review grant in the state of Florida, and the first one in the country that was done in a regional approach. And very happy to say that we've been successful across the state. In my other hat, as the vice chair of the statewide Florida Defense Alliance, we've been very successful in replicating that program. So we've got 3 active reviews ongoing right now, ours in South Florida, the one that's kicking off here, and we're helping support Eric up here and his team in Northwest Florida. There's a 3rd one down in the Tampa area, focused on MacDill Air Force Base. And there's 3 grant applications in the works expected to be funded this year that will pick up Northeast Florida, East Central Florida, and Central South Florida. And so if you think about where the hubs and concentrations of military installations are in the state, with those 3 more, we will have essentially covered the entire state of Florida. And I think that's the first state in the country to make that claim. And our success so far looks like it will line up some follow-on implementation dollars in that program, which will be really good, so it won't just identify the challenge, but start to fix and address some of them. 2 final thoughts before I hand over the mic. I would like you not to forget the word resilience, but in context of military installations and national security, I'd like you to posture it in terms of mission assurance. And if you really think about what does resilience in the community mean when you're supporting a military installation, it means assurance of the military being able to conduct their mission. Why is that important? If you look at, with the exception of Pensacola and Key West, those 2, Key West was also created back in the 1800s to help fight pirates of the Caribbean, right? So those were the 2 sort of historical military outposts in Florida. With the exception of those 2, if you look at virtually all of the other 20-some major installations in Florida, the founding date on all of them is the late 1930s or early 1940s. The Florida Military Complex was created in the preparation and the lead up in the early stages of the fight in World War II. We faced a ginormous strategic imperative to get ready for a global fight, and Florida provided the sea space, the air space, the land space that was unmatched in its ability to train the force. I would suggest to you that we are at a strategic inflection point now, and the ability for the country to reposition and pivot and posture and get ready for a potential fight in the Western Pacific hinges on our ability to better leverage the entirety of the Florida complex in a way that probably hasn't been done since World War II, and ensuring the resilience, i.e. mission assurance of those installations, is critical to make that happen. Thank you.
I'm Dr. Crisher from the Department of Government. My primary area of expertise is military power and national security, and maybe it was my house partially flooding due to Tropical Storm Gordon, or the 24 inches of rain we got from Hurricane Sally, where I started to become a lot more interested in the impact of climate on my area of study, military power. And really, my changing interest reflects growth in the study of national security. It reflects growth among security studies, where when we traditionally think of national security, it's always about facing some sort of actor, an armed actor. Right? During the Cold War, how do we deal with the Soviets? Post 9/11, how do we deal with terrorists? And really what we're seeing now amongst national security scholars is a shift to actorless threats. And to be fair and to give credit where credit is due, the military has been way ahead of this curve on sort of shifting the focus to actorless threats. And tonight we're primarily talking about the environment, which is one of the key ones, but it's also public health. We saw the impact of COVID and really a lot of the shortcomings of the US public health system, and that has a large impact on military readiness as well. So starting to see this shift is a welcome change. And these conversations that we're having here are crucial. We need to bring together the military, we need to bring together federal agencies, state and local governments, along with academics as well, to start to figure out what in the world we're going to do moving forward. As we noted, Pensacola gets a lot of hurricanes, and what we've seen the last 5 years is the sort of myth of the panhandle sort of sort of Big Bend area being immune to the major hurricanes, that ship seems to have sailed. You think of 2 Category 4 hurricanes and a Category 5 hurricane since 2018. It's major military installations in Tampa. U.S. Central Command just barely missed the last one last year. And so thinking about all of this is pretty important. So that's sort of where I'm coming at, sort of my research starting to shift, thinking more about the climate and its impact on military resiliency. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Hi, I'm Laurie Murphy, president of the Stormwater Training Center, and I have a unique background as well. I've been in the climate business for a very long time. I've always had an interest in pollution, hurricanes, weather events from El Nino to La Nina to neutral years, thermohaline circulation, and eventually I got to the point where I felt it important to understand why we have sea level rise, why we have thermal expansion of the seawaters, what is going on in Miami, which is probably one of the cities that has the lowest sea level and is actually is experiencing significant flooding. So what I normally do for my job is I go out and I work with different Clean Water Act permittees. I help to show them short-term goals. In other words, goals where we can make a difference today. For example, I work with a lot of federal developers. These are for new construction and redevelopment that work under the Energy Independence and Security Act, which already supplies a need for attenuating up to 95% of all stormwater, because we have learned over the years that it is all about controlling the volume of the stormwater, not the velocity, not the impacts. It starts with the volume first. That is what causes the flooding, that's what causes the damage. That is why our infrastructure is in poor condition. So I work on short-term goals, utilizing grants, working with local governments, working with communities, and I have spent some time working with permittees at NAS also to understand what can we do? What can we control now and today? So it's not always about long-term goals, because we need those. But how do we begin? What's the low-hanging fruit? What do we have access to? And so I think that this is a really exciting panel that we can talk about from different perspectives and backgrounds on collectively how we're going to work together as a state, more or less a country as well. So thank you.
Thank you all. I really appreciate you all introducing yourselves and sharing that information. And I wanted to start off, Rick, where you, one of the items that you hit, which is this, keep focusing on this idea of resiliency, because we're talking about climate resiliency here, which is one flavor of resiliency that is affecting the military operations. I mean, there's others, there's operational, there's economic, there's all these different areas that are meaningful. And I wondered if, and it's kind of thinking very broadly to start with, but if from your perspective, what are some of the national security implications of these severe weather events, specifically on military readiness and training and operations, and what has been your experience in looking around the state with those areas?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And I'll echo some of the comments that Tim made earlier. So one of my previous retired Navy captain, if I didn't say that before, I think it said it up there. One of my last tours of duty, I was the Chief of Current Operations at Southern Command down in Doral, focused on Latin America. And as you can imagine, a number of hurricanes and earthquakes and other natural disaster type events repeatedly in that area of responsibility that I would say probably consumed easily a quarter to a third of my year just running response operations in the region in reaction to that. And so, to your point and to Tim's point earlier, thinking about NATO and reposturing, there's a strategic implication to these challenges that should be driving how the military thinks about and prepares for conflict, and conflict being a very broad term in this sense, not necessarily force on force, but force on nature, nature on force. How the military prepares to respond to those. What does that mean for how we organize, train, and equip the force? How we budget, program, and plan the force? At the operational level, how we posture, and Florida very uniquely has a very large military footprint, but also very strategically positioned, not only for training our own force, but for responding throughout Latin America. And actually, believe it or not, the Air Force Base down in my area, Homestead Air Reserve Base, most people don't realize. They think about, it's very close to Latin America. It's also the closest CONUS-based military airfield to almost the entire continent of Africa. So if you have to flow forces out to Africa from the United States, that's your shortest hop from the largest runway available. So, how we think about where forces are positioned, how we leverage our assets here in Florida at an operational level, and then, clearly down to the unit tactical base installation level, how we build better partnerships with the communities. Long gone are the days when a military base was its own self-contained city, had its own power station, water plant, all those kinds of capabilities. The Defense Department has divested of that, decades ago. And so almost all of our installations are desperately reliant on the community and the resources and the assets that the community provides. And so building those partnerships and resilience, again, with an eye towards mission assurance, that I think is very important, particularly for a state like Florida with such a heavy military presence.
Great point. And having lived now here in Pensacola for almost 20 years, I get very used to the conversation about inside the gate and outside the gate, but recognizing that these issues that we're talking about don't stop at the gate, whether it's power and literally power and water and how they're coming across, but also the risks and the economic impacts. I mean, I showed up on the screen here now. I added an image for Northwest Florida about our various military installations. This is a pulled from Florida's Great Northwest, just to illustrate Rick's point. And so many of these activities that are starting inside the gate are coming outside and having that impact. And again, thinking from a broad perspective, and Dr. Crisher, I wanted to kind of jump out to a broader perspective with you maybe is, because you research military capabilities, war, politics, these sort of areas, and as you just mentioned in your intro, have become, in part because you're resident here of Northwest Florida and are dealing with it yourself, I've become much more aware of how those items of military capabilities, war, politics, how a changing climate affects those. And I wonder if you might speak to how, and invite others also, but how does a changing climate affect these issues in terms of the military readiness and that core military resiliency sort of concept?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And one of the things I try to remind people when we start to talk about, sort of the impact of the climate is when we start to look at where these disasters have occurred, you just, think of Tyndall. And how much does it cost to help rebuild Tyndall? Like $5 billion. And it's not just Tyndall, right? It's, Oakwood Air Force Base in Nebraska, they were flooded out. That's where U.S. Strategic Command is. That's another $1 billion. A lot of money to repair installations in North Carolina. They had Hurricane Florence right before Hurricane Michael. And when you start adding these up, you're starting to talk big dollars. And even for the military, these are bigger numbers. And so when we start thinking about military power, if you're spending your money rebuilding infrastructure, what are you not spending your money on? Because resources are finite. That's billions of dollars that could be used to upgrade, naval ships, new air power. That's not being spent on, and then even thinking more about Tyndall, the F-22s that were lost, that you're not getting them back, and each one is about 100.
The commander fly them out of there. I'm a retired Air Force senior officer. That's the question they're asking in Washington. Why weren't we planning all this military-industrial complex talk? Why didn't we fly them out of there?
panelists probably could say a little bit more, but what I will say is not all of them can fly. And so if they're grounded, they're grounded, and there's not a whole lot we can do about that. And it was just sort of, they were left on their own. But it's bad because we cannot replace F-22s anymore. And so, again, it's all just sort of compounding the loss of money, the loss of equipment, and even if we're close to spending $1 trillion on the military, there's still that loss of revenue that really impacts. And Homestead is another great example. We tend to forget Homestead was demolished by Andrew in 1992, and that had a lot of long-term impacts as well. So this isn't quite new, but if somebody else wants to address the F-22s, that's my knowledge. They couldn't fly.
And I'm not sure if there are any other answers about the specifics with Tyndall, because I know and I'm not sure how central, Eric, that what Tyndall and its recovery has been to the siting of the MER where you are at, but I don't know if you might be able to speak to both, because I've learned some great information at various conferences about the installation of the future and how they're rebuilding that area, but what your insight has been from a planning perspective outside the gate there.
Yeah, I'll kind of back up a little bit and talk about kind of how the Military Installation Resilience Reviews came to be. It's been about 10 years since the Department of Defense has really recognized, I mean, this isn't new, but realizing that you can't just handle it within the bases. You've got to look out at the communities that are around. And so about 5-6 years ago, the Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation, which is charged with helping communities deal with the bases. And while the bases are really a great boon for communities, huge economic impact, I think it's 52% of Escambia County's economy is from the base, there's also some difficulties that come from having a base in a community. A lot of noises and heavy equipment, things like that. Tax base that isn't taxable, things like that. So there's a Department of Defense office specifically working on how do communities cooperate with the bases so the communities can best support the bases, which in reality are often their biggest economic drivers. And so Tyndall obviously was the very first line of our application once this authority came to the Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation to fund this kind of research where you look around the communities and how can the communities better support the bases, and then how can the Department of Defense better support these communities in that symbiotic relationship. Our very first line was, this isn't hypothetical up here, right? I mean, we've seen through what happened at Tyndall exactly what can happen, and also the impact that it had on Bay County. Across the Panhandle, in addition to just the obvious impacts on some of these resilience threats, Bay County lost a lot of housing. The same potential could happen in Okaloosa County, where there's really a tight housing market. I mean, that's true everywhere in the Panhandle, but there's a tight housing market. Any housing that's lost is going to make it very difficult for when many of these bases, as they are right now, are trying to bring up. And so while we focus a lot on that infrastructure, the water, the power, the things like that, we're really going to have a pretty wide lens in looking at just the communities and how communities function, because like everything else, housing for service members and their families has been outsourced. It's now off the base. And so looking at, there's been, I believe, 2 now completed and published MERS that have happened. One in South Carolina and another in the DC area. And a lot of the projects that they're looking at have to do with housing and transportation and things like that, because if you can't get to base, if your house is flooded, if your kid's school is out, I mean, that's going to affect the ability of our service members, their families, or civilian contractors to be able to focus and get their job done. So Tyndall has brought a lot of lessons for us, and we're working with Jacob's team. Rick Miller is part of that, Captain Miller, and they've been working quite a bit on what's going on at Tyndall Air Force Base, and we're hoping to be able to bring some of those best practices out across the Panhandle, some of the bases. Thank you.
And I am going to circle back around and make sure we can follow up with a little bit more about the very near future on some of the local MIR and what some of the efforts you're doing. Tim, I wonder if, I mean, from a local perspective, and bring it back down inside the gate, you mentioned like the 2 different places where you've had to deal with this issue, one being NATO and one being right here as skipper of NAS Pensacola. And I wonder, having had that front row command chair view. If you can tell us about the way that y'all had to go through the planning, funding, and execution of both the response, but also the planning for the adaptation and kind of figuring out how to ensure NAS Pensacola was going to be in a better shape in years to come versus where maybe it was when you stepped in.
You read my mind, man. So we are often our own worst enemy in the military and Department of Defense. When a catastrophic event happens in any command, no matter where it is, a commanding officer's, the three big things that he's thinking about is, number one, it's the safety. It's controlling the circumstance, whatever it is, whether it's in combat, whether it's a natural disaster, or whether it's like the terrorist attack that we had on the base also. Controlling the event. Number two is the safety of your people, making sure that they're safe, that they got what they need. Number three, it is how do I get back to the normal operations? How do I get the base back up and running again so we can keep doing our mission? It's that mission assurance part of it. So once hurricane passes, we assess the damage, and like I gotta tell you, walking out of my house that mid-morning after that hurricane, it was like watching an old friend who'd just been beaten, battered, and bruised. The base, I couldn't drive my car down the street because of the debris and the state that the buildings were in. The house right beside me, the entire roof was ripped off with two small girls sitting in their bedroom upstairs. Luckily their mom went up and grabbed them and brought them downstairs before the roof actually came off. And then starts once we know everybody's safe and once we've got, we know we can move on to the next stage, and how do you get back to normal operating procedures? How do we sit, because that mission on NAS Pensacola is a zero failure option. When NAS Pensacola ceases to operate, that means that naval aviation comes to a grinding halt. 60,000 students a year go through that base. Everybody who touches an aircraft, flies an aircraft, controls an aircraft, fixes an aircraft, fights a fire on an aircraft carrier, you name it, they go through NAS Pensacola. So when we stop training those people, that means that all the aircraft carriers aren't getting their new people there, we're not getting new pilots, and so forth and so on. So it comes to a grinding halt. So we have a zero failure option. So how do we get back up operating again? So we did, because we got wonderful people working on that base, and they worked their tails off to make sure that we could keep on doing our mission. That became almost the worst thing that we could have done. Several months later, talking to our 3-star who's in charge of all naval installations, why aren't we getting more help? Well, because you're not showing enough pain, was his answer. Because you're still getting the job done. If you're still getting the job done, then obviously you must be okay. Meanwhile, there's people sitting with buckets beside their desks with rain pouring through every time it rained. A couple of months after the hurricane, we had a tropical storm that came through, and that did way more damage than it should have done because the buildings were in such bad state. So eventually we get, so that's the first way where we hurt ourselves, because we try too hard. The second part is, eventually we did get some relief. We got $200 million of supplemental funding from Congress, but it was the wrong color of money. It was funds that could only be used for repair work, and specifically the buildings that were being repaired could not be repaired to a condition that was any better than the condition they were in before. Because if they were, it would be military construction. Military construction dollars is a different color of money, and we couldn't use that money for MILCOM. All those buildings should have been torn down. So the idea, and I talked till I was blue in the face, about now we have an opportunity to create the base of the future. We have an opportunity to create this base for the next 100 years, to make sure of mission assurance, of resiliency. But instead, we're putting Band-Aids over those buildings because it's not the right color of money, and because it takes a lot of heavy lifting in Washington, D.C. to get money for military construction. So now this base, NAS Pensacola, the money that they have is Band-Aids. And if we get another hurricane, even when all those fixes are done, we get another hurricane, we're right back where we started. Because we are not thinking strategically about how we repair these bases and about creating bases for the future. NAS Pensacola, a lot of our infrastructure on the base stems from the 1930s, even before. We have electrical power, major electrical power lines. They're still wrapped in paper and horsehair. And so what happens when it rains? It gets in, that paper gets wet, and that horsehair gets wet, I mean, literally, the insulation is horsehair in some of the electrical wiring in our buildings. And so it gets wet, and it corrodes, and it creates very, very dangerous situations for our personnel. But it's, we are not thinking well enough about how we're going to use this money correctly and taking the right steps up in DC. Because anybody who's worked in DC knows you only work on the next budget cycle. You're not working on a budget cycle 3 down, 4 down, 5 down, and you use whatever money you can get your hands on in order to take care of the task at hand. And that's the system that we have, that's the system that we try and work within. The base there at NES Pensacola, it also, Hurricane Ivan, when Hurricane Ivan came by in 2004, they did try to create a base for the future then, because the devastation was so bad. And the buildings that were built after Hurricane Ivan, all the school buildings that you have along the eastern side of the base, they all did very well, actually. But all the 1940s era buildings were completely devastated. And now we talk about mission assurance, we've lost several missions on the base that we're not going to get back. So the more times we have weather events like this, bit by bit, we're going to see missions that go away because buildings have been condemned, they're not worth repairing, so forth and so on. So if we don't get it right, if we don't repair these spaces right, one day we're going to wake up and NES Pensacola is going to be gone, and we're going to wonder why it happened. Because we weren't good custodians of what we had.
Thinking about that and where NAS Pensacola was and where Tyndall is, of course, now, and I'm wondering, obviously the scale of the destruction at Tyndall was greater than what we were seeing in Pensacola. But I'm wondering about the lessons learned, or maybe just the difference, if anyone can comment about differences in either the bureaucracy or the politics that really led to them really leaning in hard for Tyndall as being that installation of the future and what they're, I mean, obviously they lost a lot more and they weren't able to band-aid their way through, and so I think they had to get down there, Tim. Is that accurate?
Yeah, there's a lot of optics there also. So Tyndall is the master jet base for F-22s, right? So there's an optic to that. And it's a war fighting, it's a readiness, and NES Pensacola is a training base. And so anytime we look for money as a training base, our knees get cut out from under us because it's not going to operational needs. And really, if you want to be honest, we could take everything in NES Pensacola and put it somewhere else. The reason that NES Pensacola was chosen as the first naval air station was because it was shut down. It was available land. And Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels told Henry Mustin in 1914 to come down here with a couple of fabric-covered airplanes and about 50 people and said, make a naval aeronautical station, and they did. And it was on the beaches because they needed water in order to fly seaplanes. But that's why it's here. It could be anywhere. It could be in Indiana. It could be, you name it. It could be up in Minnesota, although it wouldn't be very good for winter flying. So the Navy also looks at this, like if we don't need NES Pensacola to be where it is, but it's too expensive for us to move it somewhere else because they consolidated so much of their training down here in Pensacola. So they're kind of caught. They're caught through here. But from a strategic perspective, it could be anywhere.
Interesting. Rick, you mentioned before that you've been with the South Florida Defense Alliance and others, and certainly recently have had huge issues with the last season's hurricane system. How have the installations there and the mission command as such responded to these similar sort of activities even over the last 18 months? And are we getting smarter about how we're responding to that? Are we getting more strategic about some of those activities?
Yes and no. How's that for an answer? There we go. So, yes, and to the gentleman's question earlier about, moving aircraft, Tim, very familiar with this challenge, moving things out. I'll say, writ large in Florida, the commands and the bases have, I don't want to say gotten that down, but for the most part, they're pretty rehearsed at being able to do that. One of the really unique challenges, and somebody mentioned earlier at MacDill, you know, I think you might have mentioned, you know, we've got two Unified Combatant Commanders, SOCOM and CENTCOM, and then of course SOUTHCOM is the third one in the state. Very interesting, and having been on the COCOM staff, when they have to do what we call COOP, continuity of operations. And so, you know, the big hurricane's coming right for the headquarters, and down at SOUTHCOM, when the new facility was built, they built the base, or the building, a Cat 5 survivable facility. At least that's what it was advertised as. It was finished and they moved in December of 2010, as I recall. I got down there about 3 months later and took the role as the current ops chief. And of course, you know, contingency response, COOP, all those things fell within my portfolio. So I started asking around. I'm like, well, okay, I get it. The walls will stay up. We can all hide in here and survive a Cat 5 blow through. I said, but can I conduct operations out of here in a Cat 5 hurricane? And the command engineer just kind of gave me a sideways look because he was very proud of this new installation they'd just built. And I said, yeah, that's great, but I said, I got to be able to communicate. I got to feed people. You know, people have to go to the bathroom. You know, the poop has to go somewhere, right? I'll do all those functions work. And oh, by the way, back to the MER, it relies on a lot of stuff out in the community that may not have been built to Cat 5 survivable standards. And do we really know what that survivability is out to what radius from our facility? And so there was a lot of head scratching and the uncomfortable conversation to go back to the 4-star and say, well, sir, you've got a Cat 5 building, but maybe not a Cat 5 command center. And if a Cat 5 is coming at us, we might have to move out of state. And then, oh, by the way, what if that Cat 5 wiped out, let's say, Haiti en route to South Florida, and now we're running a major crisis action team response in the region, and now I have to pick up that entire operation in headquarters and continue to sustain it, but do it on the fly while I'm moving it, say, out to Arizona or some other alternative site. And of course, everybody thought I was crazy. It's a black swan, that'll never happen, never happen. Okay. 3 years later, I was retired, working in a private enterprise not far down the street when the hurricane went through Haiti and was bearing down South Florida. And one of my old lieutenant colonels that was still there called me up one day and he goes, hey, you remember that black swan thing you came up? We're executing that right now. You know, so, I mean, to Tim's point, you know, we learn some things, we don't necessarily learn all the lessons all the time as quickly as we need to. And again, I go back to and we've kind of hit on it, you know, much of the Florida complex was built late 30s, early 40s for the imperative of World War II. A lot of that infrastructure is that old. And you know, we are at a new strategic inflection point. The potential criticality of Florida to help prepare for that in our installations is really there. And so we need, I think when I say we, the big we, Washington and the state need to, I think, really develop a new conversation around what does resilience, i.e. mission assurance, really mean for the military in Florida? And what does that mean to reposition all these installations, capabilities, and training facilities that we have here in the state? Because we really do have some things that are unmatched. You know, the ability to put together sea space, airspace, undersea space, cyberspace, and do all that in several hundred miles by several hundred miles, all in the same general area to train forces on instrumented ranges. You can't replicate that anywhere else but Florida. And so if we want to leverage that for the future, we've got to think differently.
Well, and that does bring up all those issues that you're just talking about. We talk about so many of them within the state university system as well, because we're here to support, you know, the current generation and next generation of not just military operations, but operations in the state and the nation. And I think that helps me to, you know, kind of think coming back from there. And Horace, I was hoping that you might be able to comment on bring that broader viewpoint, because you've consulted on, you know, climate resilience planning and urban and regional planning, especially tied in with climate, and both for cities and municipalities, but also national levels. And I wonder, because so many of these lessons are difficult to learn and we're learning them in necessarily extreme circumstances, is there something that makes climate resiliency planning different from military installations, or what kind of lessons can we learn from the operations that are going on at the state, federal, international level that help to maybe inform how we can best do these sort of military resiliency planning? If there's any lessons learned that you have from there.
Yes, thank you. Easy question, right? I have 40 minutes.
No problem. You have at least 4 minutes, yes.
Well, I think this is a great question. It ties well with the colleagues here on the panel had to say about the preparedness. And the general integration of strategic planning and resilience planning. You know, there is a difference between resilience planning and how we integrate resilience planning versus climate resilience planning. Because when you look at even in the state of Florida, they have a great resilient funding program. And studying that, you know, the state of Florida has one of the best vulnerability studies that it does and provides funding for local communities and governments. And I know military does that, looking at military readiness and assurance and looking at through the resilience lens is how to ensure that these new assessed threats and vulnerabilities are integrated into planning. So integration of strategic resiliency planning into these elements is critical. The other one is really collaboration. I hear, you know, from bureaucratic point of view, I study administration. I teach in public administration. So it's critical to really find ways to make more adjustable and adaptable ways of investments, and investment is critical. If you provide funding and then you just say you can't use funding for anything but to bring it back to the old way of doing business, then you're not doing anything or anyone any favor. The other thing is really training and exercise, and where military does a great job is retraining and how we integrate training into these types of plannings. And those are the things that work well. The things that don't work well in studying national level government, state level governments, and internationally and nationally here in the United States is really insufficient data. If we don't have data to back up and understand what our threats are, we're not going to be able to address those threats. And where we find, and I know military does a really good job at analyzing current and ongoing threats, but I do want to emphasize climate resilience and climate change as a significant threat that changes the dynamic of how we operate. And we've seen with the hurricane and frequency of hurricanes and changes in increased intensity of unpredictable increased intensity of frequency of these hurricanes that can significantly affect these military installations, that we need to take that into consideration. And also collaborative nature, that usually we don't have that access as local governments or state governments or national, except for national level of government, to work directly with military. But I think that's a critical component where businesses work directly with the military and the military installations, because obviously if you look at the data there, the Northwest Florida has a direct responsibility for over 186,000 jobs nationwide, and that's a significant impact. So we must really think of these, what I consider 4 elements, is integration of resilience planning into strategic planning and collaboration and strategic investment that's more, I would consider that more smarter than what we've seen in the past, and then training and exercise that is consistent with the current threats that we see. So I hope that answers your question. I can talk about it. I actually predicted you're going to ask me along those lines. I have a 2-page paper here.
This is the danger of having the professors. But I saw Rick also had.
I just wanted to just quick follow up to that point. I know a lot of the comments that all of us have said somewhat come across as a bit of gloom and doom for Florida. But when you think about wildfires and heat and rolling brownouts in California for months and months at a time, and the impact on the installations out there. You mentioned the flooding in Nebraska at Offutt Air Force Base and the river flooding. The bases up north with heavy new winter storms, right? These kind of challenges aren't, I mean, we have our unique challenges here in Florida, but resilience, mission assurance challenges aren't unique to Florida. And I will say one of the things, and Eric has heard me say this, our MERS studies in Florida, one of the things we must do is actually, in addition to highlighting all the challenges we have, capture the things we do well. And what reminded me was when you said Florida's got some of the best resilience planning in the country, and we do. And you know, we've got things in our electrical grid because we've been living with hurricanes for decades, where our grid is a hell of a lot more resilient than the grids in a lot of other places in the country. It's not perfect, but we also don't take credit and advertise. You know, the perception in Washington is everything in Florida is either going to sink under the ocean because of sea level rise or get scraped off the face by a hurricane. And that's, we all know that's not the reality. And you know, unfortunately, our reality doesn't get reflected strategically through some of those plans as well as it should.
I do want to come back and on the way to that resilience review and kind of delve into this, but as an element of that, Laurie, I wanted to get your point, because one of the areas that all of these different topics that we're talking about come back to infrastructure, and the infrastructure, what is on, some of the military infrastructure that's inside the fence line, but then the civilian and support infrastructure outside that fence line. And you know, it's hard to think about something tied to infrastructure that is more, no pun intended, fluid than our stormwater. But I wonder, you know, stormwater is an example, and stormwater controls as an example, but more generally, if you have any thoughts on what that role of planning for the infrastructure, its importance, and also, you know, how different, you know, whether it's licensing or certifications or others, how that can help make these this sort of planning easier, better, more robust in the long run.
Yeah. So first of all, I just want to make a comment that I was definitely not aware of the different color of money, and kind of saddened to hear that, and that's most likely very political, which brings me to the point where a lot of things are very political when it comes to change. And it boils down to, I think the positive thing that we have to look forward is Embrace. And Embrace is now going to pull aside some funding for military bases to focus on development and redevelopment. And that's why I wanted to bring that to your attention, because I had no idea, someone who's on the outside, what goes on the inside. And I think that's important, and I'm not really sure how to grasp onto that money, but I'm sure you folks here on the panel would be better at doing that than myself. But I think that's a positive step in the future. Secondly, I just don't think there's enough information. People don't understand why stormwater creates so many problems, and it goes back to impervious surfacing. The more we develop inside and outside of a base, creates more sheet flow. You have more sheet flow, you have more velocity, more pollutants, more problems. And we've got to get back to using Mother Nature. It's simple as it is. Hundreds and hundreds of years ago, we didn't have a lot of impervious surfacing, so we didn't have these kinds of issues. But in order to protect bases and communities, we've got to get back to Mother Nature so that we can attenuate that stormwater, recharge aquifers that are depleting all over the country. Thank heavens for atmospheric rivers in California this year, or they'd probably still be piping underground in Utah. So I think that has a lot to do with it. We've got to look at the simple steps, things we can do now, low-hanging fruit that we can grasp onto, including funding. I know the state of Florida has some really good resilient funding now, but several years ago they had resilient funding for military bases. So where did that go? I'm kind of, curious about that, and maybe you folks might know more about that than I do.
One thing I want to, because I've reviewed for this panel, this is outside of this, all this stuff is wonderfully outside of my area, so I get to learn all kinds of new stuff. But one of the things I was able to do is brush up my acronyms. And just for anyone out there who may not know, Laurie mentioned the Embrace Act. And so we have, this is enhancing military base resilience and conserving ecosystems through stormwater management. And this is a funding program that was built into the fiscal year 2022 Defense Authorization Act. So this idea of planning ahead on how we can deal with surface water, how we can deal with stormwater, again, is being recognized as a mission critical sort of event, so much that it's literally going into the National Defense Authorization Act, the highest funding models that we have here. So yes, looking at those resources, working at a university, I'm very familiar with different colors of money, what we can and can't do with them, and all the challenges that are in there. One of the ways that we can use some of this funding does come through these MERS, and we've kind of been touching around it, but I think this might be a wonderful opportunity because inherently collaborative is what these MERS are, and I wonder, Eric, if you might be able to kind of talk more broadly about the nature of that collaboration that goes into these resilience reviews, and maybe some thought on what the goals coming out of them are, because I think they're directly tied in with what we're talking about.
Well, I'm going to start by using your event to promote our event. So we're actually kicking off this Military Installation Resilience Review, really taking all these big ideas we've been talking about and applying them to the 6 military installations in all the local governments here of the Western Panhandle, from Tyndall Air Force Base all the way over to NAS Pensacola. And the kickoff, after a very long time working through all the different complications of the federal governments and working with military bases, getting all the signed letters, about 2 years of work has gotten us to this day where we're going to kick it off on Wednesday. So at the Okaloosa County Administration Building in Shalimar at 10 a.m., 10 to noon, from 10 to 11, we're going to have a kind of overview of what the process is going to be. We've got some keynote speakers, including the skipper from Whiting Field who will be there, and Jim Bagby here from Congressman Gates' office, who will all be there to kind of talk about what this is, why it's so important, get everybody really in line, and then the second half we're going to start doing some visioning around the bases. So the first half will be available for those of you that can't make it out there. You can watch it online. If you register, check it out on our website, ECRC, Emerald Coast Regional Council, ecrc.org. Go to our calendar there and you can get information on registering. But from this, we're going to go through the typical resilience planning. We're going to look at all of the issues that affect the area, from wildfires and drought to the ones that we know about, things potentially sea level rise and strong tropical storms and hurricanes. Then we're going to look at all the infrastructure that's out there, what's potentially vulnerable. And then we're going to try to dig into, if this were to fail, what might the mission consequences be for the community, but especially for the military bases, because that's the argument that we're going to use to try to get additional funding to try to move some of these resilience projects, some of these solutions up in funding cycles and things like that. But really, I would say probably most of the things that we come up with and are proposed in this are not going to be surprises to the people that are working in these areas, right? Florida is a state that has done a lot of work in this. Resilient Florida has funded a lot of local governments to already look into things. The military installations themselves have done a lot of work into their resilience. The difficulty is going to be, and I'm hoping to spend as much of this process as possible, is on that collaboration piece. These things that are everybody's job is sometimes nobody's job. And that's kind of where the role of a council of governments like us can come in and really try to help kind of be the convener, bring people together to say, hey, this is something that's complicated, because one thing that I can think of right now offhand is Thomas Drive in Bay County floods onto naval sport activity, Panama City. It's an issue that's complicated because it's really kind of, the stormwater reality of it. It's one slope that goes right here. Thomas Drive is fine, but it floods the base, including obviously the planning office, the most important part of any base. But to do it is really, some of the funding is going to be county money, some of the funding would have to be military money. The contractors working on it would have to work really on both sides of the fence. One of the very boring parts that I won't spend too much time talking about here is working with how military installations actually are able to contract and use local governments to do work through intergovernmental support agreements. That's one element of what we're trying to work here, because those color of money issues, those collaboration issues are really oftentimes the sticking points. It's not so much knowing what we need to do, it's getting everybody in line and figuring out how we can do it. So we're hoping to spend as much time as possible. So if you are excited about these things and you want to be part of the solution, really it's going to take a lot. It's going to take a lot more than maybe even traditional people that work on issues like this. So show up Wednesday if you can, Wednesday 10 to noon in Shalimar. Send me an email, get on our email list, and we're looking for anybody who can be part of the solution for these in the Panhandle. This will be about an 18-month project, so we've got quite a road ahead of us.
Matt, to amplify, amplify Eric's point, one of the great things about these MERS studies is it helps the local community make that defense connection, right? Like, to your point, Eric, I mean, they probably know they've got a stormwater management problem in this area, or that, you know, the substation is challenged. But now to make the nexus to defense that, hey, not only does this support the community, but it's critical to national defense, because if this substation goes out, the base loses power. You know, simple example. That just now gives them the ability to bump the priority when they go to get funding requests. It also, because you make the connection, there are specific programs in the Defense Department that the communities now can tap for funding to get that project taken care of that they otherwise would have not had available to them. And so those additional pots of money, and again, all these studies are intended to have a implementation and funding strategy component to them, you know, to help people identify. And that's why I stress, you know, there's a lot of bad things being said about, you know, climate change and that in the Defense Department. And I really, you know, to me, this is about mission assurance. And that's why I stress that point up front, because this is about making sure the base can do its job. And if we can help the communities help the base, we get a double bang for the buck that's ultimately invested, regardless of how, you know, different colors of money and pots of money that we stack up to try to address these challenges.
Yeah, and I think that's the point that we keep coming back to, is that this is about the mission of each of these bases, wherever they're doing, and the system having those missions, that what is mission critical there. And I think importantly, and this is something that I certainly learned by, you know, in my prep, and it's evidenced by the completed MERS that have already been done in different places or that are underway, is that this is an area that the Department of Defense recognizes an area they need to invest in. We need to look at, not because necessary. So my own background is I came into the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. I was chair of that department, and there's a lot of reasons why people in that department would want to talk about these sort of issues. But the fact is, this is about, can these installations continue to operate, or what happens when we lose all these F-22s that are left on the runway and aren't able to get out, and how does that affect our core mission? That's what's important, and I think that's one of the points that I wanted to make sure before I get out and able to ask for some questions from the audience. What I would like to open up to the entire panel is asking for any and all of you for your input or your thoughts on, when we're talking about issues of climate change, climate adaptability, all these climate resilience. What are your best examples? What are your best reasons for why these issues are important for the missions of our installations in Northwest Florida, but also, Rick, to your point, fires in California or droughts in Arizona? These are also areas. So why these issues are important for the core military mission of our bases. I just want to kind of open that up to y'all. And Horace, yeah.
I'll be brief. As a non-military person, I believe in the U.S. military power projection in the world, and I believe that military readiness depends upon readiness and strategic planning of all these military installations. We have so many here in Northwest Florida, in Florida, and the issues are really relevant to how well the military is going to be prepared and ready for threats that we're going to be facing in the world. So I believe the climate adaptation, climate mitigation is just one area, and adaptability and changing how we think and our paradigm, strategic planning is critical.
Thanks.
You said it all.
That's excellent.
Mic drop right there.
I think one of the things I hope people would take away, it's already been sort of hammered home at this point, is the ripple effects that happen from these events are vast. They're just vast ripple effects that we see when installations are impacted. Right, you can't run a mission in Haiti, but also long term, because we tend to focus a lot on hurricanes, and that makes sense. That's where we are. But rising waters, right? The rising waters are a big deal. And Captain Miller noted, things are getting a little dicey in the Western Pacific. Well, one of the things we need are more ships. we need more ships, but if your naval yards are underwater, you're in a whole lot of trouble. And so, we see on the East Coast the rising in nuisance flooding in our naval yards on the East Coast. We're starting to have issues here by Mobile. And so if we're not thinking more about how to deal with these, again, there's just all of these different potential ripple effects. So I think if we can start to focus the conversation on that, sort of thinking about the missions and the potential ripple effects, both at the sort of lower level, operational level, but more strategic level, I think we can hopefully start to get on the same page. Hopefully. And the one thing I keep coming back to, and unfortunately I'm cynical by nature, is that there's sort of a saying in national security and foreign policy that politics stops at the water's edge. And that's the way it's supposed to work in theory. Right? Once we start talking foreign policy and things like that, politics no longer matters, everybody's on the same page. And that's a lovely fantasy world to live in. It's truly a fantasy world. So the reality is politics are still going to come into play, and we need to appreciate the politics and sort of how that focuses in all this as well. So it's not just sort of the national security implications, all that, but it is, politics are still going to matter, and we have to sort of figure out how to work around the politics as well. So that's
Well, and Brian, to that point,
I was talking to a colleague about it today, and he sort of tongue-in-cheek said, rising sea levels is great for ships, but really bad for the shipyards. And I'm like, yeah, that's a really good point. I like that point.
Tim.
I was about to say something that you just pinged on. Two things. They're kind of elephants in the room. DoD does not like to deal with existential threats. They like threats they can sink their teeth into. China, all that, the stuff they can really sink their teeth into. Russia. Climate change is, it's real, it's happening, it's affecting our bases, but it's not something I need to spend money on right now because I got China and I need to spend money on this other stuff. And then the other elephant in the room is politics. Climate change is politically divisive. Right? So we can have conversations like this all we want. We're all of a like mind in this room, otherwise we wouldn't be sitting here. So we're sitting in some could view it as we're sitting in our own echo chamber, talking about this. So we're all nodding our heads, agreeing with this, that it's an issue. And there's an entire 50% of the population that doesn't believe that. That thinks that it's nonsense, that this is just a cycle we're going through, so why spend all this money on doing that? Now there's problems with both of those arguments. So the military doesn't like to deal with existential threats, but then when it happens, in this time of very scarce funding resources, it costs them 10 times more when the event happens than it would have cost them just to harden the base, the installation. And then with the political standpoint, when it happens in somebody's district, why aren't you doing more? This is your crisis to deal with. Why haven't you brought in more money to our district to ensure that this didn't happen in the first place? So when it happens, it's always worse for the individuals involved, but we can't seem to get on the same page to say, this has to happen. We have to harden our bases. We have to make them more resilient. Because if we don't, just like you said, now we don't have the resources we need when the real you-know-what hits the fan. When at NAS Pensacola here, we don't even have secure places for our naval flight officers or training to be able to talk about current threats. They've got to go somewhere else to do that. And the hangar that we have is falling apart. One more hurricane and it's gone. And then we've got to figure out where those pilots are going to go, or those naval flight officers are going to go to be able to do their training. And that's going to be a break in training. And then while we're trying to figure out how we're going to refix Pensacola, they're missing all this great training that they're going to do. So in World War II, we could churn out pilots like this. They didn't even get a book to tell them how to fly every different plane. They just got into a plane because all the planes were designed pretty much the cockpits to look the same. Now our aircraft are so complicated. They're so diverse that it's the equipment, it's the systems that are on these aircraft that you have to have almost a doctorate, the equivalent of a doctorate, to be able to operate these things. And it takes time to train our pilots and our air crew and our flight officers and our weapon systems officers. And when we start losing facilities where we do this because of weather events, now what does that say about if we do get into a conflict? How are we going to be able to churn out these personnel to replace the ones that we're losing? We're not going to be able to. It's already happening at NAS Pensacola. what has happened at NAS Pensacola, the state that NAS Pensacola is in today, is a direct threat to our ability to counter the threat that we're seeing in the real world today. So if we don't get a handle on this, it's going to hurt. It's going to bite us. It is it's an existential threat, but it's a real one. It's a real one.
Yeah, that area is one reason why this topic has been so interesting to me, is that this is one of these broad, existential, very large-scale threats, but it has very real, immediate, and direct impacts on operations at each of these installations.
Just when Tim was talking, I started laughing internally because, one of the things a lot about authorities and money, it's also our bureaucracy has built up over time. A typical environmental impact study, and not to say they're not, that they're not important, we shouldn't do them, absolutely. But a typical study on a base to, put something new in or change a mission, 4, 5, 6, 7 years sometimes. It took us less than 4 years to fight the entirety of World War II. It takes us twice that long to do one small environmental impact study. So, if you just want to put a finer point on, magnitude of challenge versus timeline ridiculousness, the ability to tackle some of these problems, we have done it to ourselves.
So I want to make sure we had some time for some questions, if there are any out there. I'd be happy to, someone can raise their hand, I can get you a mic, or it's a pretty quiet room, I'll be able to just, yeah.
Fortunately, our enemies or foes, potential foes, don't they have the same problems, or worse?
No.
No?
There are 4 people to every one of ours. They have a lot more money. They don't have any debt. I worked over there for a number of years. They're coming to get us. It's just that simple. They want to take over the world. They're working strategically all around the world with a plan. We can't work. This commander here knows what I'm talking about. And we're in serious need of kimchi, folks. Climate is a serious problem, and I know that for a fact. I started the Climate Institute in 1986 and traveled the world trying to alert the world to this problem. As an Air Force Reserve officer also. But we're in serious deep trouble. China, and this man here is bound to know, the answer to the Congressman's representative is bound to understand that. I don't know, we're the tail wagging the dog here. We're the tail on the dog. We go do our studies, we spend 5 years, we follow all the formats, we get all the grants, we do all this stuff right here. Who writes the grants? Military Industrial Complex. Who gets them pushed through? 100 lobbyists from various companies up there. A lot of people in America being so trained so poorly, they don't even know who Eisenhower was, or the Military Industrial Complex, they don't understand history. Kids are becoming digital, they don't even talk to each other. We got a hell of a problem in this country. The Chinese are laughing at us. They're laughing at us. So,
Sorry.
that's all I got to say. That's not a question, it's a statement. Excuse me.
No, thank you, sir.
I do want to answer the question. I think it's a valid question. The foes and enemies do have same issues and same concerns and probably working on it. And they were addressing, I studied some of these climate change, climate adaptation and resilience studies in other countries, and they are trying to address them. And I was just joking aside, ChatGPT will just do all of these environmental studies in the future, so we'll be fine.
But I'd say those man-made islands that the Chinese are building in the Pacific, I hope that when the ice caps melt, that they get submerged. But as I used to work for John Milley, and as he used to say, hope is not a course of action. So, and we don't hope that they have worse problems than we do. We just got to take care of our own. I hope they've got big issues. I really do.
Brian, I wondered if some of because I think some of your studies are not just about the American military, but that international. I wonder what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, I mean, all of our foes have issues. It's probably not exactly the same as ours, but they do certainly have issues. And you know, I think mostly we're talking about China, so let's just talk about China. You know, in particular, so they maybe not have the same sort of you know, big storm events and things of that nature, but they still have climate-related issues. Pollution, the air quality is terrible over there, and as they grow industrially, the air quality is getting worse. That has public health implications. And so if you've been paying attention to the news lately, this is having, along with a lot of really bad policy decisions, demographically, China is in severe trouble. I mean, severe trouble demographically. And if you didn't hear, they're no longer the world's most populous country. They've lost that to India. And their population is going down, and it's starting to go down rapidly. And that's going to have huge long-term strategic implications, and part of that is related to environmental issues they have, along with public health issues they have. Again, that sort of actorless threat we bring up. And I think it was Captain Kinsella brought it up. You know, when we think about Russia, right, we're starting to have more competition in the North Atlantic, and sort of as the ice caps melt. So there's other foes have issues. It's maybe not the same as American issues, but they certainly have them, and it's going to have long-term impacts for them. So a lot to watch out for.
Indeed.
Okay, so this is actually going to be a two-part question. Since we know that the standard basis to being prepared is doing a threat, you know, to know what our threats are, right? To know what our threat assessments is. And since we know based on history that climate has turned the tides of war, right? I mean, we can look back at a ton of conflicts in past history and know that climate, will there be a big snowstorm or something, or a harsh climate through that area, the side that's had the resources to sustain has come out on top. So this more is a question for you guys that have been involved, is where does that threat assessment lie with climate well, where exactly does that lie? Do we even see that as a threat assessment? I know do we even have that in a higher rank with our threat assessments right now with the climate? And if we don't, what is that path to get people to see that as a threat?
I'll start that and then feel free to join in. So I would say in past years, the Defense Department had not strategically in threat assessments looked at climate to the extent that you articulated it in your statement in question. I will say in the last, I don't know how many years, 4 or 5, certainly within the last decade, that as a topic of strategic interest has risen in more prominence. And so when you look at documents like the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, and then inside the Pentagon, underneath the National Defense Strategy, you've got a number of different, strategic planning process documents that help drive those planning cycles. The impact of climate has begun to be reflected in those. Now, is it at the level that you, I think, wished for or hoped for? Personal opinion, I would say probably not yet, but it at least has begun to pop in there in the last few years, where in past years I would say it was not, climate was something that we dealt with operationally, and the staff meteorologists dealt with it when it happened, in an operation. Now it's, again, to that strategic operational level of war thinking, how do we provide training, equip, and prepare the forces to deal with those implications going forward. So it is starting to show up.
I'd say just listening to your question there, you brought up historical times when weather has played an impact, and I think that's certainly on a tactical level, on an operational level. The Mongols were turned away from Japan by the kamikaze winds, the winter on the Russian front against Germany, the Spanish Armada trying to invade England. It was scattered by the winds. But so the military very much does think about weather from an operational perspective and from a tactical perspective. And how do we ensure that we're best prepared to do it? We're operating in the high north a lot more now. We're sending amphibious ready groups into the Baltic. We sent the Harriers Truman Strike Group into the North Sea last year to do operations. Aircraft carriers are not meant to operate in the hot waters of the Persian Gulf. They're designed for the North Atlantic. And we've started getting back to that and trying to re-engage that muscle memory of how we operate in more diverse weather scenarios. So strategically, I think that's really what we're talking about here, is getting more engaged strategically. Tactically, operationally, I think we've always done that. Strategically, thinking about how weather might change in the future is something I think in the past 10 years, we're just starting to grapple around. And again, it's pretty political. It's the Department of Defense will put as much effort into it as the administration wants them to, because it requires resources, it requires funding, it requires money, and if it's a priority of an administration, then DoD will put money into it. If it's not, they won't.
And Congress.
And Congress, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. Other questions?
How much would it cost to fix the airplanes? What would you say was a good project for them to do everything it was to do to achieve the goal of making it hard against airplanes?
Now that's a question of all questions.
Can you repeat the question, please?
The question was, how much would it cost to get NAS Pensacola back or to a hardened position where they're more weather resilient? I'll give you an example. So we want to build a consolidated hangar at NAS Pensacola. 3 years ago, the cost for that was $80 million. Recently, the cost was given again as $180 million. We have wildly out of proportion cost escalations in our building that are wildly out of whack for what the civilian world could build the same thing for. Because there are so many regulations, there are so many rules, there are so many cost like pads that are put in there to ensure cost overruns. There's so many.
10% of that's the 7-year EIS study.
It is, yeah. It's at NAS Pensacola. If you kick a stone, you're going to get a fine by it because you have upset some type of archaeological dig. So that is the $200 million that we did receive would have been a long way towards it, towards building buildings. So the terrorist attack that happened, right? So in order for us to build a brand new building that would be state of the art, do everything that we needed to do, that building to do that it does now, about $45 million. We spent $60 million just putting new air conditioning, insulation into the building after the terrorist attack. We could have built a brand new building for that, but we didn't because it wasn't Milcom money. And there's a lot of emotion into it also because it's where it happened. We wanted to rebuild that building that was so historically significant. But it's just an example of where we put money that may not be the smartest place to put it, but we do it because we're shackled by by policy, by legislation. So the price tag, I wouldn't even dare put a price tag on it because it has changed a lot in the last 5 years what it would cost. It's doubled, tripled what it would cost now. What the Navy perhaps, not, I should be careful my words here, not what they would like to see, but a scenario would be, we get another hurricane and our hangars get knocked down. Now, the Navy then asked Congress for a supplemental bill to get extra funding to build their hangars. If Congress were to tell the Navy, the Appropriations Committee were to say, Navy, you are going to build a hangar tomorrow, then that money comes out of the Navy's budget. If it's a supplemental funding because of an emergency event, it doesn't come out of the Navy's budget. So that's much preferable to the Navy. So Tyndall, for example, it was all supplemental funding. It's all funding that was on top of the Air Force's budget. So that's one of the reasons why they're able to build it so Gucci and so resilient, because it's not Air Force money. It came after the fact. And the Navy would love that. They would love for a hurricane that came. I shouldn't say they wouldn't like a hurricane, don't get me wrong, that's not what I mean, but if it was going to be replaced, it would be replaced with somebody else's money.
Thank you so much. It's been listening. Unbelievable power in this field. I'm a guest of the rest, so I have no idea. Really interesting. Thank you so much.
And to Captain Kinsella's point, when you look at the defense budget in very broad terms, and this is true for all the services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, they've got a series of accounts that they generically call investment accounts. It's research and development, and it's the appropriations that buy new equipment and systems. So airplane procurement, ship procurement, those things. That's what they call investment. They have operations and maintenance, which also includes some facility restoration support. And that pays the bills day to day to, run the ships, run the airplanes, run the facilities. Obviously, there's manpower that pays for the people, and there's military construction. But within the balance of those accounts, traditionally the services will, I'll say, rob money out of the facility and infrastructure side to pay the bills or pay the shortfalls in the force operations and maintenance or the investment accounts. And it's the prioritization of operations and mission over the support and sustainment tail end behind that operation stuff. And that's gotten to the point where I think in the Navy, the backlog of facility modernization is, the last number I saw was like 75 years or something. They're 75 years behind schedule on getting facilities caught up. Right? That has traditionally been a bill payer year over year over year to support the operating side of the force. And people go, well, my gosh, we give the department, hundreds of billions of dollars, how can they not have enough? Well, I mean, my simple example is if I gave you $1 million, are you a millionaire? But if I give you $1,001 in debt, I just made you a $1 debtor, not a millionaire. And that's the situation the military is in. They have a lot of money, but they've got way more requirement than they've got resource to keep up with. And so every year they're constantly trying to figure out where can I, reduce and cut to cover my must-pay bills. And unfortunately, for decades, infrastructure has been not on that must-pay bill list. And so now when you're getting hit with this additional challenge of resilience and climate challenges, it's just, to Tim's point, it's piling on old, outdated infrastructure that is not anywhere near ready to deal with those challenges.
And very quickly, to say, how do we get to this point? That's the truest word. He said, everything else he said was obvious, but that was really true, what he just said. No, I'm just kidding. So our bases, Navy infrastructure, is funded. If you owned a business and you only funded that business to 57%, how long would you stay in business? You couldn't. So Navy installations are funded at 57%. I think it's actually lower now. I think it's more like 48, 49%. So half the money that is budgeted for Navy installations are going to other places to fund other things. So over time, so that means in 2 years, 50%, 50%, that's 100%, and 50% another year, another 50% another year. So how are base commanders supposed to even begin to fix the issues that they have when they don't even have the money to fix current issues, never mind issues from last year and the year before? And that's where we are. That's how we get to 75-year backlog of our maintenance at our bases.
I know we have some other questions, but we're running out of time, so I want to make sure we have an opportunity to thank our panelists. Before we do that, I want to thank each of you for coming out. If you do have questions, we're going to be around for a few more minutes, and please do come up and ask. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and if you can please help me join and thank our panelists for their And thank you very much to the American Security Project for all the work that y'all done to put this on. Thanks again, y'all have a great evening. A lot of good discussions started here. Oh, don't forget, Wednesday at 10 o'clock, The mirror event is going on in Shalimar. Thank you all so much. Good night.